So welcome everyone to this session of the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. Today we discuss a paper by Christoph Binkelmann titled Schelling's Doctrine of the Potencies in the Ages of the World. But before introducing the speakers of today's session, I would like to kindly ask all the participants to switch on their cameras if possible. Of course, there is no obligation, but it would be nice if you could do that so that we can see each other. And I also would like to mention that after the official session, we will keep open the Zoom meeting for more informal conversations. So you are all very welcome to stay and to have a chat after the session. As for the structure of today's session, it goes as follows. So we will have a 40 minutes presentation by Christoph Binkelmann. And then we will have a 8 to 10 minutes response by Kyla Bruff. And then we end up the session with a 13 minutes Q&A. You will have the chance to ask your question. So let me now introduce to you the speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Christoph Binkelmann. Christoph Binkelmann is assistant professor at the University of Freiburg. He is also a member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities, where he is a project coordinator of a project titled Schelling in Munich. His areas of expertise are German idealism, ancient philosophy, and philosophical anthropology of the 20th century. He has edited numerous editions of Schelling works, but I also mentioned some of his most recent publications, which include a monograph titled Wissen des Nichtwissens, Tendenzen des kritischen Skeptizismus, published in 2022. And I'll also mention one of his forthcoming article on Schelling titled Modern Tragedy of Life, Schelling Between Ethics and Art, forthcoming in Schelling Studien. And our second speaker is Kyla Bruff. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Kyla Bruff. Is assistant professor at Carleton University. Her work primarily investigates the metaphysical commitments of political positions and the relevance of classical German philosophy for politics today. She recently co-edited the Palgrave Schelling Handbook, which is forthcoming and will be published by Palgrave Macmillan. The volume will contain a number of contributions, also one of her contribution on Schelling, titled Schelling and the Frankfurt School. So take a look at the volume when it is published if you are interested in the topic. But let me also mention another of her publications on Schelling, titled The State as Second Nature in Schelling's System of Transcendental Idealism, published in the volume Life, Organism, and Human Nature, Perspectives on Classical German Philosophy, published by Springer in 2023 and edited by Corti and Schulain. So without further ado, I now give the floor to Christoph Binkelmann. Please, Christoph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pierpaolo, for the introduction, and thank you, Karen, for having invited me. It's a pleasure for me to spend this early evening with you and talk about Schelling. I have added a main title to my paper. It's called The Beginning of the Beginning. And I will talk about Schelling's doctrine of the potencies in his Ages of the World. Schelling's project, The Ages of the World, which he pursued between 1810 and 1827, but never published, is still fascinating and daunting at the same time. Time and again, researchers have attempted to uncover the meaning and sometimes even the structure of Schelling's intended work based on unpublished drafts and fragments. These include a version of the first book of the Weltalter, which Schelling's son, Carl Friedrich August, compiled from manuscript and published in the Sämtliche Werke, two galley proofs of the first book from 1811 and 1813, which Manfred Schröter published shortly after the Second World War, when the originals had just fallen prey to a bombing raid, as well as countless drafts still accessible in the Schelling-Nachlass at the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Some of these have already been published, But this is only the famous tip of the iceberg, about 200 out of 2,500 pages. If much of it had not been burned in the Munich University Library, there would probably have been at least twice as many pages. Whether a curse or a blessing, let everyone decide for themselves. Since the beginning of 2022, we have been working on the edition of the Weltalter fragments in Munich and Freiburg. The focus here is firstly on readable texts and secondly on the presentation of their intertextual relationship. I don't want to bore you here with technical and philological details, but instead use the following studies to demonstrate in a performative way to what extent this new textual basis can also provide a new perspective on Schelling's Weltalter project. In doing so, I have to emphasize that these studies are preliminary, in process, and can and will be surpassed by further research. I will therefore now give you a philosophical laboratory report. Schelling planned the ages of the world in 3 books, which were to encompass the past, present, and future of the world. Among the fragments, you will find vast amounts of drafts for the first book, about 70% of the total. For the second book, there are few elaborated texts, but many overviews of the structure. For the third book, there is nothing. In the following, I will therefore concentrate on the first book. In the first part of my talk, I would say something briefly about the project of the Weltalter and that of the first book. I will then turn to the first book and there only to the beginning, or to put it more clearly, to the beginning of the beginning, and the doctrine of potencies developed there. So the first part is called The Project of the Ages of the World, the Dialectical Movement of Universal Life. If one examines the countless attempts, including notes and fragments, on Schelling's introduction and the first book of the Ages of the World, 2 things are striking even at a superficial glance. Firstly, there is an excess of new restarts, which break off after only a few pages. By this, I mean that the majority of the fragments begin with the notorious sentences, and this is quote 1 on the handout. You all know the sentences. The past is known, the present is cognized, the future is divined, the known is recounted, the cognized is presented, the divined is prophesied. As is well known, these sentences structure the 3 planned books of the Ages of the World by linking their topics, past, present, and future, with the epistemic modes of knowledge, cognition, and divination, as well as their expressive forms of recounting, presenting, and prophesying. With regard to the first book, the reader therefore expects a narrative. The known past is recounted. A historical science that is close to a new fable or mythology and is categorically opposed to the dialectical deductive approach of some predecessors, especially Fichte and Hegel. However, this prejudice is not true, at least not for the text from the Weltalter, which, according to Schelling's own statements, remain in dialectical waters. Schelling cannot do without dialectics, and it seems highly questionable to me whether he ever at least hoped to arrive at a non-dialectical philosophy. In my opinion, it therefore makes more sense to elucidate the special nature of this dialectical method and to distinguish it from the methods of Fichte and Hegel without losing sight of their similarities. A closer look at the role of dialectics in Schelling will show, roughly speaking, and most of this is not new, that Schelling, with Hegel against Fichte, argues for an absolute dialectic or dialectic of the absolute, not a dialectic of subjectivity, but interprets it with Fichte against Hegel in a voluntative way, a dialectic of freedom that cannot be understood in purely logical terms. I will come back to this in a moment, but I would like to make a further comment here on the permanent new restarts of the fragments. They convey the impression that Schelling repeatedly picks up the beginning of a thread of evidence that carries him along for a while, or rather leads him along, until it frays more and more and finally breaks off completely. This can also be seen from the fact that the handwriting becomes increasingly sloppy, and there are more and more marginal notes and crossing outs. One, if not the central reason for this, lies in the fact that he tries to put himself into a movement of thought that one can only follow from its beginning and therefore has to restart with every break. In order to understand what this movement consists of, we must move on to the second remark. This remark leads deeper into Schelling's thoughts behind the project. A large part of the Weltalter consists of a discussion of the so-called Doctrine of Potencies. And here one can find a further counter-argument against the supposedly undialectical presentation of the ages of the world, at least in a certain sense. The Doctrine of Potencies appears very schematic, almost mathematical, logically deductive. Even in his early writings on natural philosophy, but above all in the text on his philosophy of identity from 1801 to 1806, Schelling took up Fichte's attempt to derive I and not I from the logical laws A equals A and A not equals non-A, but introduced his own version A equals A equals B, A squared, and A cubed. This you will see in scheme 2, or number 2, where I tried to juxtapose Fichte and Schelling's attempts and potencies or principles, something like that. As with Fichte, for Schelling, these formulas describe the fundamental structure of reality in an abstract sense and stand in a dialectical relationship to one another. Schelling insists, however, that these are not activities of the I, but potencies of the absolute. The Weltalter project aims to provide a science of reality that understands reality not as something static, as immutable being, but as universal life. That means in the sense of a temporal or historical development. Accordingly, it is the task of knowledge to, I quote, grasp the connection of movement from the beginning to the end. And here we can already hear the thread of evidence breaking again and again. For Schelling, as for Hegel, this movement of universal life begins with the immanent differentiation of the absolute, or the Godhead, which ultimately leads to the creation of a world in nature and spirit. The latter was to be the subject of the second book of the Ages of the World. The fundamental tendency of life consists, borrowed from the metaphor of plants, in an unfolding from the depth or the ground into the revealed or the external. Knowledge does not objectively observe this unfolding, but is itself part of it as the most explicit revelation. Therefore, the historicity of life is found in knowledge itself, which by no means consists in asserting a discrete truth, such as S is P, but rather in passing through propositions such as from S is P to S is Q, etc., in a dialectical way. The particular propositions are not true in themselves, but only as part of this movement do they acquire their relative truth. Due to this historicity of knowledge, the highest science must also move from the deepest depth of historical movement, that means from the most distant past, in order to ultimately produce a system of times. If one undertakes to clarify the basic structure of this movement of universal life, one comes across the law of ascension, which, as Schelling boasts, he himself, I quote, as one who has invented so little, may well address as my invention in philosophy. The ascension consists precisely in the continuous potentiation of life, the moments of which constitutes the potencies. By the way, Schelling is, according to his own remarks, turning against the doctrine of emanation, and thus against contemporary attempts to interpret his own doctrine in a Neoplatonic way. For Schelling, the original movement of the absolute is subject to an ascension and not to a fall or descension. Second chapter, the beginning of the beginning, Schelling's doctrine of the potencies. How is the beginning to be made in this movement? Schelling shares the problem of the beginning with his earlier colleague, Hegel. Like Hegel in his Science of Logic, Schelling repeatedly deals with the problem in the Weltalter manuscript, but less reflexively than performatively. In addition, Schelling distinguishes between 4 periods of the beginning. The first period is still before the beginning and deals with the first one. The second period serves to prepare the beginning. The third period is the beginning in a proper sense, which, however, only begins in the fourth period, the beginning of the beginning. To illustrate this, you can imagine a car driving off. The first period represents the car itself. The second involves the turning of the ignition key, that means starting the engine, followed by stepping on the gas, which only leads to the wheels spinning. It is only in the fourth period that the wheels get a grip and set the car in motion. A further similarity with Hegel is that Schelling thinks of this beginning in terms of the categories of being and the negation of being, which enter into different relationships with each other in the different periods. So let's start the car. 2.1, first period, the first one, or the car itself. According to Schelling, the first one cannot be addressed as an existent, determined something, nor is it the non-existent in the sense of the nothing, from which here he, Schelling, is and remains Spinozist. Nothing can become and therefore begin, ex nihilo nihil fit. In this respect, Schelling calls it a super-existent, Überseiendes. And here a remark in the following, I will translate Schelling's terms of Sein and Seiendes into English by using the terms of being, Sein, and existent as Seiendes. There are some problems in doing so, but for me it sounds convincing to use this translation, so I will use it. But at the same time, insofar as it is not non-existent, the super-existent, it is existent, and insofar as it is not existent, it is non-existent. Schelling finds this entanglement of neither existent nor non-existent, and as well existent as non-existent, expressed in the idea of indifference, Gleichgültigkeit. Yet the primacy of the first view of neither nor prevails, which is expressed in the fact that in essence, Wesen, it is neither existent nor non-existent, but in form or possibility, it can be both. Here, as it were, the first still weak concept of potencies emerges in the sense of a possibility, a power, from which the dynamis of movement is launched shortly afterwards. The first one is thus, I quote, pure indifference, the unconditional unity of subject and object, of existence and non-existence, since it is neither of the two and yet the power to both. Schelling explains this by referring to the concepts of essence and form. According to this, the first one is the unity of essence and being, that means of essence and form, which is why the as well as is only present in pure potentiality as ability. It has not yet stepped out of unity with essence. The formula A equals A can be used to schematize this. But Schelling is concerned with more than a purely logical understanding, as he critically objects, certainly with Hegel in mind. And this is number 3 on your handout. I quote, there are enough people who would like to dissolve everything, even the deepest things, into representation. But it is not representation, it is desire that comes first. Desire is the first one, end of quote. Understood in this voluntative sense, the first one is therefore the will that wills nothing or that does not will. It is eternal freedom. 2.2, second period, preparing the beginning or starting the engine. Therefore, the indifference, the first one, can be interpreted as a libertas indifferentiae, which, however, does not make its beginning out of a conscious arbitrariness, but rather in accidental arbitrariness. From the first one, the beginning of the movement now prepares itself as follows. According to the very meaning of the word, the beginning cannot be a giving, communicating, overflowing, etc., but there is a capturing in the beginning. In German, there is a Fang in Anfang. Capturing means Fang, and in the German word for beginning, Anfang, there is the capturing. That means a taking or attracting. But since there is nothing else in the beginning, eternal freedom can only attract, take, want itself. It turns into a project, Vorwurf, by which Schelling, however, again, does not want to understand merely a theoretical object, but an object of desire, a bait, Lockspeise, like a carrot for a donkey. Likewise, the transition from eternal freedom to beginning is not a logical, necessary movement, but one of free, groundless decision, which does not happen consciously, but seems fateful. For eternal freedom is condemned to itself. It is its own necessity, without, of course, knowing it at this point. The original subject-object indifference, the unity of freedom and necessity, thus gives rise to a duality, that which attracts and that which is attracted. The transition from unity to duality now also entails a new potency. A equals A becomes A equals B. It is important to consider the following. According to Schelling, that which attracts is B, that which is attracted is A. This could be surprising at first. For me, it was surprising insofar as in A equals B, an equation that Schelling, like Fichte, or even more so, understands as a predication, A, that means the attracted, is the subject, while B, the attracting, is the object or predicate. In the proposition A is B, the subject has the role of the inner, the hidden essence, which is expressed by the predicate in the outer revealing form. Taken together and understood voluntarily, eternal freedom by willing itself is encompassed as the willed in the will. This is number 4 on your handout. I quote, the general expression of self-attraction, or also of the first form, is A equals B instead of A equals A, whereby it is indicated that the essence or being, A, is here the enclosed, captured, while the will or desire, B, the enclosing, embracing. For Schelling, attracting here also means dressing. Anziehen in German also means dressing. The formerly naked will receives a covering. In A equals B, in the duality, the original unity, the A equals A, is thus also contained in to a certain extent as the actual subject of this something, which is both revealed and concealed by the form. This is number 5. I quote, in this respect, it, that means the unity or A equals A, now presents itself at that uncognizable entity of which the ancient philosophers already said that it is neither cognizable with the form nor without the form. For insofar as it is outside the form, it is beyond all cognition, because without all expression and revelation. But as soon as it is within the form, it is covered by it. It is the inner and hidden. Yet the form or duality is its revelation. Thus, one can also say that it is only revealed as something hidden, that it is only cognized as something uncognizable, that it is only known by not actually being known, ignorando cognoscitur. In A equals B, being and non-being now also have a different relationship than before in A equals A. In this actually first period of development, because the first one itself is still, as it were, beyond any development, A first, still hesitant and yet not yet completely clear differentiation of the categories existent and non-existent begins. Thus, on the one hand, what is attracted, insofar as it is willed, is posited as non-existent being, but only according to the concept or intention is it existent. That means the existent idea of a non-existent of which one wants it to be. On the other hand, by wanting it to be, the will turns itself into something non-existent, for it is driven by a lag. A non-existent wants to be existent. But even the willing is not merely non-existent, for, I quote, by really wanting something, it does not only want to be existent, but is existent. As in the case of indifference, there's also an ambivalence or entanglement of being and non-being, of existent and non-existent on both sides. Yet this does not lead to falling back into unity, but is clearly decided by virtue of the will. The main tendency of the will lies in the transition from non-existence to existence. Eternal freedom wants itself as such. That means as existent, because it itself neither is nor was. True eternal freedom, that which matters to the will, the essence is therefore not that which attracts, but that which is attracted. In this, however, eternal freedom feels itself to be captured by his own will. I quote number 6, "For eternal freedom, form is, as it were, the magic circle that it can no longer break through. However, that is precisely why it is inside it, as the one that does not know what is happening to it. That is why duality or form is for it the unforeseen, the unexpected, the unwanted, which it can only experience as something that has been thrust upon it, only as a destiny." Shortly before, I already indicated that the transition from libertas indifferentiae is not a conscious, free transition in which God, unlike Buridan's donkey, can choose one of the two haystacks, to be or not to be. Rather, the transition is blind, fateful, an incident that, of course, does not come from outside, from evil-minded gods, for there is so far only one of them, but rather happens to freedom through itself. This is where the mythological component in Schelling's development of the absolute becomes clear, taking on dimensions of a tragedy. Without wanting to, freedom finds itself in the grasp of fate. Yet the will in which eternal freedom is caught is also its own will, only it does not recognize it as such. Already in the first one, freedom and necessity were intertwined and one. Freedom was its own destiny. Now, in the emergent duality, both moments are more opposed to each other. And all that remains for freedom is to realize, to give birth to itself in its destiny. That means in the necessity of being wanted. In this way, it is in accordance with fate, admittedly, again, without knowing it, which also wants its realization, its transition into being. So let's go to the third period, the beginning or the rotation of the wheels. The new period in the development of potencies that is now beginning deserves special attention, as it has not yet been clearly identified in research due to the lack of a textual basis. Up to now, the first one we had, so to speak, was the potenceless A equals A, from which the first potency, A equals B, emerged. The development still to be expected now consists in the fact that the essence, A equals A, is set as existent. That means is realized. This will take place in that it rises above A equals B, not only as a simple A, but as an A posited as existent. That means as A squared, only to be truly posited as such in the union with A equals B in A cubed. So much for the intention, but in reality, we are still at a lower level. Eternal freedom undertakes the attempt to realize itself in the form in A equals B. From this, however, still dependent forms of the major potencies emerge, the so-called minor potencies. In numerous fragments of the ages of the world, Schelling deals with the crucial distinction between major and minor potencies, which can only be probably understood if the fragments are placed in relation to one another. A short unpublished fragment is very helpful for our purpose. According to it, eternal freedom, as that which is attracted, lies in the darkness of the form that surrounds it. That means in the duality of A equals B, with which it struggles in order to realize itself as eternal freedom. A return to mere purity and indifference is no longer possible. That's number 7. I quote, "So there is only one thing left for it to do, to make the something that it is, the form, the attractedness, external to itself at least, as the mere something of itself, to set itself against it as the existent of this something." A far-reaching distinction takes place here, which will also be applied to the major potencies. In order to be as a unity, eternal freedom sets a difference to its form, which is responsible for the duality. More precisely, eternal freedom seeks to realize itself, to free itself from mere being wanted, in order to establish itself as existent. For this to happen, the form itself must first be posited as non-existent. For the existence of the form of the will is precisely the condition for the non-existence of freedom. In order to elevate itself as existing, it posits the form as non-existent, but not as nothing. Otherwise, freedom could not elevate itself as existent, but would fall back into the first indifference, which, according to Schelling, is not possible at all. Here, a new, once again, differentiated relationship between being and non-being emerges. Whereas in the previous period, the will rendered something non-existent by willing it, that means by positing it internally. Now the essence turns the form into a non-existent by positing it respectively, that means relative to itself, externally, as a non-existent. It posits it as something of itself, as Schelling writes. That means as something that is not itself, but nevertheless of itself, as it were a part of itself. This part, however, is something other than itself. And to illustrate this, remember the biblical myth of the creation of woman from the rib of man, and this is exactly what Schelling thinks about here at this passage. However, in a more logical understanding, a new relationship between being and non-being opens up here, in that the non-existent now becomes the ground on which the existent rises. Schelling's distinction between the ground of existence and the existent, which he has been promoting since the Freedom Essay, find its categorical genetic location here. The non-existent is now that on which the existent is founded as its substratum. As Schelling never gets tired of emphasizing by referring to Plato's Sophistes, existent and non-existent are relative terms, whereby the following applies. Everything is existent or non-existent, depending on the relation. There is nothing that is only non-existent, and insofar as something is non-existent, it is being for another. Looking back to the first one, where essence and being were still in indifferent unity, both are now separated from each other. The existing essence and its basis of being, without being completely separated from each other. The ground is only the ground of the existent and vice versa. Two aspects of this development inevitably catch the eye. Firstly, the unity under or in duality attempts to realize itself as unity, which is why the external positing also takes place within A equals B. Schelling therefore calls the externally posited form minor A equals B. And you can see this number 9, where I wrote the minor potencies and their relationship to the major potencies. The elevation as existent above this, Schelling calls minor A squared. And secondly, the unity in this way obviously falls prey to a new duality, namely that of the two minor potencies mentioned, so that a minor A cubed must be targeted as the third potency, since only in this, as the unity of minor A equals B and minor A squared, the duality is overcome. And this is number 8. I quote, "We call the form stripped of essence and reduced to mere externality to being by minor A equals B, the essence that rises against it to existence by minor A squared. However, once begun, the progression does not stand still here, but the essence enclosed in major A equals B turns duality, as it were, into the suffering feminine of itself and progresses itself into the existent, as it were, masculine, only to show itself by means of that and to rise above both as the purer, as it were, sexless essence, in itself neither existent nor non-existent, that is minor A cubed, which is nevertheless as such. There is a qualitative change here, which one of the fragments brings to the point. Whereas in the major potencies, the A equals B, the attracting B was still a quite indeterminate willing of eternal freedom. The will has now in minor B become concrete and is activated. Schelling therefore calls the will in major B craving or longing, Sucht und Sehnsucht, as the will that is not yet determined. This is how Fichte and the early Romantics addressed it. In minor B, on the other hand, desire, Begierde, arises. This number 10, as we have already said, what we called craving is more of a suffering process in itself and relates to the aroused desire. We call it minor B to indicate the relationship and the difference from craving or major B, as mere hunger relates to the active seizing, taking hold of and consuming of the material offered. The difference is also that the craving is one with the essence, but the aroused attracting desire is in opposition to it. Consequently, the will also differentiates or concretizes itself further at this point from the will that does not want via the still quite undefined longing to desire. All these are, of course, still unconscious forms of will. At this stage of development, the movement also finds its actual beginning. That means the beginning only begins to be such a beginning. However, this is afflicted with certain shortcomings, or rather contradictions, which will ultimately contribute to overcoming it. This is necessary since only in this manner the beginning can also be the beginning of something. With regard to desire, the contradiction is clear, and I quote number 11, "The essence in the beginning wants itself as real, and yet in this very wanting it pulls itself into itself. It desires to exist, and yet in this very desire does not make itself existent. It thus spins around itself in an eternal circle. It wants itself, and in wanting itself, it becomes non-existent. And in feeling itself as non-existent, it only desires all the more to be existent, thus only pulls itself into itself all the more. Desire pulls the potencies into itself, wants to have them in intenso, to pull them together into one point, as it were, or to lead them to exist in one another, what Schelling calls ad in existentiam. Only in this inwardness can eternal freedom realize its original indifference. At the same time, however, it also fails to do so, for the simultaneous existence of the potencies, what Schelling calls in existentia, means their non-existence, which Schelling also calls in existentia, and thus the persistence and continuation of desire. With regard to the potencies, this means as follows. In order to realize itself, the essence has first posited the first potency, minor a equals b, outside itself as its ground, so that it can rise to existence, to minor a squared. Beyond this, the existent indifference, minor a cubed, finally emerges. For only this is the existent indifference of the existent, minor a cubed, and non-existing, a equals b, minor a equals b, and thus realizes the original freedom. Yet because the first potency is already outside of eternal freedom, this also applies to the following potencies, which are only then when the previous potencies are. The first potency cannot be as such, namely as ground, unless the second exists. Both in turn cannot be, I quote, then by positing the unity as the third, as minor a cubed, outside itself. And the later cannot be without the antithesis, whereby it literally returns to the first potency and closes the cycle, rotation, or wheel. All these are terms of Schelling. According to the argument of the Sämtliche Werke, each potency, in order to exist, presupposes the previous potency as existent, but by positing itself, it posits the later as non-existent, as its being, and thus negates itself as existent. That means posits itself as non-existent, and thus posits the following potency, which it serves as non-existent, that means as being, in order for the later to exist. In this way, an infinite movement results, although not a progression, but a circular course. This rotation, which Schelling also describes with the biblical term of the wheel of birth, trochos genesios, illustrates how becoming, werden, arises from being and non-being, and this can therefore also be seen as a counterpart to Hegel's logic. I quote, "This rotation is indescribable because it does not stop anywhere. It is only there in motion. Wherever you want to grip the wheel, to bring it to a standstill, it will be disturbed. For it is nothing but an eternal becoming without all being, the life that ceaselessly consumes itself and gives birth again and again." End of quote. Even if we are still in the imminent development of the absolute here, there is nonetheless an analogy to becoming in nature, so that we can refer not only to Hegel's logic, but also to his phenomenology. In Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, desire becomes a new desire in every apparent fulfillment. According to Goethe's dictum, from desire I rush to satisfaction, from satisfaction I leap to desire. In Schelling, too, desire is involved in a permanent turmoil. The comparison goes even further. As with Hegel, the cycle of nature in Schelling is a first failing attempt to establish self-reference, which is only overcome and elevated in self-consciousness. Eternal freedom also strives to posit itself as existent and therein to become for itself. And I quote Schelling, "But the initial for itself is necessarily unconscious, although one incessantly struggling for consciousness." This is the beginning, and I quote, "Violent but futile endeavor to get out of the successive into the simultaneous is the necessary first thing in every beginning, including the eternal. How or by what means was life redeemed from this rotation and led into freedom? Or in other words, I quote again, it is necessary that what is incomprehensible in itself if it nevertheless wants to grasp itself, gets caught up in this rotation. Yet must it necessarily remain in it? Eternal agony is unthinkable, but how can it escape the torment? I will now only briefly comment on this exciting question of how the major potencies, especially A squared, will emerge. And I go to the fourth period, the beginning of the beginning, or the car is driving, very shortly. From the vicious circle of becoming, the linear progressive becoming now emerges in the fourth step, and therefore the actual real beginning of the movement takes place. This presupposes a real separation or decision, a separation of the potencies, which Schelling calls crisis. In that A equals B makes itself the substratum, that means the being, A squared can rise above it. To make a long story short, let us refer to the Christian Trinity, which Schelling also cites at this point. The paternal power, the B in A equals B, begets the Son, the A squared, and thereby also first becomes the Father, which Schelling calls the A equals B. To find a shortcut for our car, only with Jesus Christ we found a driver for the car, but the car and driver only merge into one with the Spirit, as it is always the case with good drivers. I come to a very short conclusion. What's the point? Perspectives. What is the point of reopening a failed project of Schelling enriched by countless handwritten fragments? Well, if the doubt expressed in this question has not been mitigated or even further inflamed by what has been presented, I would like to end by very tentatively and briefly mentioning 3 points. The first is of a philosophical historical nature. As already indicated several times, the fragments, by offering us a deeper insight into Schelling's laboratory, enable us to see that the ages of the world, as mythical, mystical as they may appear, especially in the version of the Sämtliche Werke, are nevertheless supported by a logical framework that, if not connects Schelling with strictly rational thinkers, such as Fichte and Hegel, at least brings them into a discussion. The old question of whether Schelling was the overcomer, realizer, or whatever of German idealism would find a new, hitherto disregarded textual basis here. Secondly, it is only with the publication of so far inaccessible texts that Schelling's philosophy can be reliably assessed. For Schelling was not only the thinker of classical German philosophy who lived the longest, but who did not publish a single book for the last 40 years of his life. In the text published by his son, the central doctrine of potencies in particular is usually given very brief and only superficial considerations. Carl Friedrich August Schelling was a theologian, which is unfortunately all too often apparent from the way he organized the text. With a fresh look, however, other topics such as Schelling's understanding of method, dialectics, the structured movement of life and natural philosophy, or his idea of human freedom and an ethics appropriate to it, could come into focus, which, thirdly, treats subjects in a way that, without forgetting the past time between then and now, could still offer inspiration today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for this very rich presentation. I now give the floor to Kyla for a response. Please, Kyla.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for this fantastic talk and for offering us a window into your work, including through references to content in the Weltalter fragments. And thank you also for presenting a remarkably clear paper on such a complicated topic, probably the clearest paper I've ever heard on the potencies. So thanks for that. I loved your reconstruction of the infinite movement of the minor potencies and the ways in which each potency must treat the previous potency as non-existent, and thereby negate itself and posit the proceeding potency, which ends up serving then a wheel of birth, if I've understood that correctly. And I also very much appreciated that treatment overall of the minor potencies, because I've read little work on it, and I think I learned a lot from your treatment of that topic. So maybe for us, you could say a bit more about how the movement of these three potencies, the minor potencies in particular, does or does not map onto the movement of the major potencies, and especially how the unity achieved in A cubed or minor A3 is or isn't like the unity of spirit or the third potency, the third big potency, which you briefly mention at the end of the paper. Okay, so I have 5 points to make, and they're not in chronological order, but in Schelling fashion, they're in, I believe, logical order. So the first one is about the will and its association with the first or the absolutely unconditioned, so the will that wills nothing. The second is about desire. The third is about the meaning of the term dialectic. The fourth is the nature of the decision. And the fifth, which we may not get to, but I'd like to ask about it, is about the status of this higher science or knowledge that you mentioned at the beginning of your paper. So let us begin with the will. I keep thinking, Christoph, about your car metaphor. I love it. And this is not just because I was tempted to like enter into AI a formula to make a picture of Jesus driving a car and then like melding into the car, but I was like, don't go too extreme here. But I love this image. And I'm not mentioning that just for laughs. I mean, I think it's a real serious question if the pure difference or unconditional unity at the beginning is, as you kind of make an analogy for us, the car itself. Here's my question. What presumptions do we have to make about the car in order for starting it to even be possible? Well, it seems like it needs to have an engine, and this engine, in my opinion, is the engine of will. So I'm curious what you think of my extension of your metaphor. And in relation to that, a lot of my thoughts about your paper in general had to do with that simple quote at the end of the first section on page 5 of the physical paper that you make. And these are Christoph's words, also quoting Schelling. But it is not representation, it is desire that comes first. Desire is the first. Understood in this voluntative sense, the first is therefore the Schelling quote, will that wills nothing or that does not will. It is eternal freedom. So first, and this is an old Schelling question, so I'm sorry to repose it again, but there hasn't been a fully satisfactory answer to it, in my opinion, and maybe there never will be. That is, whence the association of the will that wills nothing with the absolutely undetermined? And how does Schelling justify this? And this is why I think it's rich to ask the question again in the context of your paper, because I wonder if it's only through a retrospective analysis of the relation of the potencies that we can say, yes, at the beginning there is a will. And second, is the desire that you and Schelling are speaking of in this context the same desire you write about later in the paper? Or is it desire as a capacity for desire, that this not yet desire at the beginning of the beginning? I'm just interested in that relationship of the will that wills nothing in eternal freedom, and the status of desire and arguable stages of desire in eternal freedom. Okay, so now I'm at desire, and on that point, I'd like to say a bit more about it. Desire came up multiple times in the paper, and your distinction, Christoph, between the craving will in B and like big B, and the desire in minor potency B as an act of seizing and even consuming as opposition to that craving was really interesting for me. And then when we continue with your analysis, we find there's a contradiction with regards to desire itself. And this is in relation to that beautiful quote on the handout, number 11. That's where Christoph uses or brings in Schelling's analysis of the contradiction in desire that goes, the essence in the beginning wants itself as real, and yet in this very wanting, it pulls itself into itself. It desires to exist, and yet in this very desire does not make itself existent. It thus spins around itself in an eternal circle. It wants itself, and in wanting itself, it becomes non-existent. And in feeling itself as non-existent, it only desires all the more to be existent, and thus only pulls itself into itself all the more. So I was so glad, Christoph, as well, that you brought up Hegel and the phenomenology at the end, because I kept thinking about desire also in that context, and the way, especially in the section before the master slave, desire is this kind of consumptive, destructive, power, I guess, but that is necessary for the next stage in the phenomenology, and by extension, the application of reason and the development of consciousness. And it seems to be that there are some comparisons there that maybe we could talk about, but in any case, desire involves permanent turmoil, as you put it, but it's super interesting that this is always a productive turmoil. So I was wondering if you maybe wanted to say more about the similarities and differences in desire between Schelling and Hegel, and perhaps something else about its link to Zimtzum, or the idea of production and productive contradiction in God. And here I was thinking also about Habermas's analysis. All right, so this third topic, as I mentioned, is the meaning of the term dialectic. So I hope talking about dialectics and the dialectical will bring us into a discussion about the status of negation and mediation in Schelling's many formulae. It could also offer us a possibility to chat about the status of each of the terms that Schelling equates in these formulae, and how precisely each term of the equation stands in relationship to one another. But I do have a clear question. Can you clearly clarify what you mean by a dialectical relationship of potencies? And what is dialectics? How do we define it? Is the doctrine of potencies really a dialectic? Early in the paper, I was trying to sort of ascertain what you mean by dialectic, because I wasn't totally sold that the relationship with the terms is dialectical, only because I'm so tainted by the notion of a Aufhebung, or the necessity of a sublation in dialectic. And presumably in a Schellingian dialectic of the potencies, there is no Aufhebung, but I would like to know what you think about that. And again, earlier in the paper, when I was trying to think about what it might mean, you talk about the dialectical presentation or possibility in the ages of the world, and you put it as a doctrine that appears very schematic, almost mathematically, logically deductive. But my question here was whether the dialectical is the same as the mathematical and logically deductive, and moreover, can all of the terms and moves, especially between attracted and attracting, A and B, be described as dialectical? In any case, I'm pressing the point because to say something about the dialectic or dialectical is to say something about mediation. It's to say something about the other, always the other term. And in the context of the potencies, I think, especially the notion of non-being and how it does in a way mediate being. So it seems to me that the beginning with the minor potencies is self-mediated in a way, without an absolute mediation, because we still have that ground existence structure that is never at least a sublated or totally like a structure involving a total cancellation. But then when we move from big potency A to big potency B, we're left with a decision and a radical break and a stepping outside of the beginning. So I'm left wondering, what's the status then of A when we move to B? Is this a dialectical move? If so, how? And I've mentioned these unities already of A cubed and major A3, because I think kind of analyzing the unity at the ends of these two movements we're describing with the potencies could help us see the differences with Hegel. Very briefly or curtly said, do you think both of these unities could be described as dialectically achieved? It seems to me anyway to be challenging to say that the relations of the Trinity are dialectical, because that's a type of dependency of persons. And by extension, each potency is not absolutely mediated, because the three persons of the Trinity must remain themselves so they can relate to each other as complete self-mediated persons, thereby enabling Schelling's analysis of relations of love. And even if propositional formulae of the potencies could be understood dialectically, we still need to discuss what type of relationship is a dialectical relationship. What is the significance of the copula or of the equation in these logical laws? I was really interested by the fact that it seems to be an expressive power to identify two terms that are not in the same, but this is why I'm linking it to the dialectic. It seems those terms themselves cannot be collapsed. So the contradiction actually needs to be sustained between the terms, just as the contradiction between ground and existence needs to be sustained for the universal movement of life to continue, because those contradictions themselves are life-giving. Okay, so there were some other quotes that I'd like to, or I wanted to talk about, but maybe I can just reference them in passing. This quote about the antithesis that you make on page 10 of the paper was really interesting. That leads into the rotation of the wheel of life. But I noted it just because it caused me to ask whether dialectics requires the productivity of negation through the return to the beginning of the cycle via the antithesis in a way that does or does not entail Aufhebung. And what is the status of the unity that's achieved when the cycle completes itself? And what type of resolution is that unity? The last things I wanted to say, I can summarize in a couple of sentences. So those were my three major points, and I had two minor points at the end regarding decision and regarding the status of knowledge in the project. Real quick, I just want to know if the decision that you mentioned, Christoph, earlier in the paper with regards to A1 kind of beginning this whole process, you described as the transition from eternal freedom to the beginning as not a logical necessary movement, but a free, groundless decision that seems fateful. Whether or not that's similar to, I mean, to put it again very shortly, the decision of God who becomes the father to beget his son. Is there any difference in those decisions and how and why? I was curious because you've used this term fateful, which kind of seems to involve some form of necessity in the first decision. But in relation to the second decision, we have this entering of the Son into time, and you know, Jesus Christ is the driver of the car, and the driver and the car merge into one in spirit. And I'm wondering if that also is the same type of decision. Last point, the status of knowledge in the project. Christoph, we were both recently in Freiburg for that event on the 1804 Würzburg system. And as you know, the status of science and knowledge was a massive theme there. And you do mention the earlier identity philosophy and some, you know, gesturing to later stuff in the paper. So just opening that massive question of the theme of knowledge and the highest science in these three periods. So in, let's say, 1804 Würzburg system, Ages of the World, and Darstellung der rein rationalen Philosophie. Is there one thread of continuity in Schelling where all of these projects seek a higher knowledge or a higher science? That's the end of my remarks. And thank you so much for such a beautiful and an interesting and important paper.
Thank you, Kyla, for your points. I think you touched on very important points. And I give now the word back to Christoph if he wants to give a brief response.
Okay, I have about 5 minutes to answer these questions. I should better write a book. Thank you very much, Kyla. Your remarks and questions are very important, and you met the point. So I will try to answer, not to your satisfaction, but I will try. Your first question concerned the concept of will at the beginning, or at the first, for the first one. As far as I understood you correctly, there are 2 points or 2 aspects. The first one concerns why Schelling uses the concept of will to describe this absolute or the indifference. And the second one concerns the question of the transition, the most difficult question in Schelling's philosophy, how the indifferent comes to pass to difference. And I'm trying to combine these 2 points because I think that Schelling uses the concept of will. He often writes it to understand it in a human way, menschlich nahelegen or verstehen. And that's exactly why he has the possibility to describe the indifference in, I would say, 2 perspectives. There's the first perspective, and this is the perspective of the essence, where there is an absolute identity, where you cannot distinguish between two elements or more elements, cannot say anything about this indifference because it's not comprehensible. And you have the second perspective, and that's the humane perspective. That's a perspective that is only possible because there are humans. And out of this perspective, you see that there is the possibility in the indifference to pass to difference. And this transition is for Schelling just a fact. You cannot describe it in a purely logical sense. There is no logical necessity for the indifference to pass to difference. But this has already happened. And this is happening all the time. And this fact can only be narrated or only be described. But the way of description is not only an anti-logical way, it's also the attempt to combine logical with non-logical descriptions, I would say. And I think both aspects are very important to regard and to consider. But it's not that. Now I see that I'm answering all of your questions in one, so I don't have much time. So it's the best way because this also refers to Schelling's concept of dialectics. This is not an Hegelian dialectic. It's not a dialectic of necessity, as Schelling calls it. It is a dialectic of freedom. This doesn't mean that there is no logical transition from A to B or from thesis to antithesis, but there are not only logical aspects here to be considered. So there is, you can call it dialectic because the contradiction is the moving power of this this development. There's always a contradiction between the potencies, and the development is only going on because of this contradictions in these potencies. There isn't something like sublation or even mediation in the Hegelian sense, but there is a way for us to understand what's the next potency, and this is a logical approach to understand it in Schelling, and this is why Schelling himself calls it a dialectic. He also refers to the situation of a dialogue. This is his understanding of dialectic as a dialogue between the potencies. So that's why it's talking about this Gesprächsweise. He calls it Gesprächsweise darstellen. That means in a way of a dialogue where the opponents are almost persons, and that refers to your question concerning the father and the son, where you have persons that are not just living persons. There are also principles, opposing principles and contradicting principles. So he's trying to mix this up to take the personal aspect and the logical aspect, and to think it as one movement. Okay, so the desire, the will, yeah. Your first question, if there are several meanings of desire in Schelling. And you're totally right with that. What I tried to distinguish was between longing and desire. There is a fragment talking about this distinction, but in other fragments you see that Schelling calls desire everything. Even the first will that wants nothing, he calls desire. And that's why he can say desire is the first thing or the first one that encompasses also the will that wants nothing. But in a stricter sense, not in that wide sense, you can distinguish between Sehnsucht, longing, and desire, and their desire only is the concrete will that takes place in the I don't know, third period with the minor potencies. So you cannot refer to all fragments and distinguish between longing and desire. There's only some fragments that do so. Most of the fragments just use the concept of desire to call everything Wollen ist Ursein, or everything desire. What is the difference to Hegel, or the relationship to Hegel, talking about desire? Was this your question?
It was just a possibility to make further comparisons or like you know, compare and contrast. I don't know if we have time for it, but I'd be curious whether you think that the desire, especially the desire that's described in the phenomenology, is similar or different from this desire that's a more metaphysical desire.
Maybe Christoph, if you can keep the answer to this question shorter, so that we can have time for the Q&A after that. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, very short answer to your question. I think Hegel used the concept of Begierde, desire, to criticize Fichte. The concept of desire and of Sehnsucht, of longing, is something you can find in Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre. So when Schelling calls this desire, he's, I think, in a discussion with Fichte and Hegel. So there are a lot of similarities and differences in their comprehension of desire that would be a good topic to dwell on in another paper. So this was my short answer to your question. Thank you very much, Kyle.
Thank you very much to both of you for this already very interesting discussion. I think it is now time to begin the discussion on the beginning of the beginning. So the floor is open for questions. And if you have questions, please just use the raise hand function that you find in Zoom. Okay, here's the first question by Lingxia, please.
Hi, Christoph. Thanks for the talk. It's very clear for me. And I have a question regarding the relationship between the movement of minor potencies and the history of pagan polytheism. Is there a relationship? If so, how? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't understand you. In relationship to what?
The movement of minor potencies with the history of pagan polytheism. Is there a relationship? Does the movement of minor potencies express the history of pagan religions?
Yes, of course. I mean, what Schelling is trying to do here and later on is trying to relate this development of the potencies to mythology. So we have this minor potencies, the idea of rotation in the what Schelling calls the astral religion, the Sternenreligion, called astral religion, Sabismus, the theory where the gods are stars, and the movement of the planets, the rotation of the planets, all that stuff. So he's trying to relate it to this stage of religious thought. Yes, I think that's very important. you have the same application to natural philosophy, to nature, where we have the planets, the movement of the planets, and probably also to philosophy of spirit. So yeah, that's the period of sabism, the astral religion, where the minor potencies are very important.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yeah, we have a question from Professor Tegmayer.
Sorry for not switching on my camera. The simple reason is I don't have one. But I have a question on regarding your claim that the Ages of the World project is failed, and I'm interested in which sense it is a failure. So obviously not just a failure in terms of being incomplete. But my question is there a kind of structural reason why Schelling starts to rewrite this project time and again without ever completing it? So is there something why it has to fail according to his own standards, perhaps?
I don't know if there's a reason that it has to be like that the Schelling has to fail in his project. I think he was searching for something like a structure. In a lot of notes, he's trying to develop a structure, several periods. I presented 4 periods. I think Schelling had 7 periods, the idea of 7 periods. But the most difficult step was the step from period 6 to period 7. There are a lot of notes where he writes transition to 7, and he fails to find a concept or a way through this this passage. But there are several other reasons why he failed. There's the problem of the presentation of the ages of the world. We had the question of knowledge from Kyla. What is how can the known be narrated or recounted? What is the method of the ages of the world? And these questions are also very important for Schelling, and he didn't find a solution to all these questions. There is a structural problem, of course. There is a problem of how many potencies, what kind of potencies, and there are a lot of ways Schelling tries to find out more and more potencies, not only major and minor potencies, but other forms. And there's the question of method and of presentation of the ages of the world. But Schelling also failed in his late philosophy to find a version that is worth to publish. So it was his problem that he couldn't, was never satisfied with what he worked on and elaborated. So I think there's also a personal problem of Schelling.
Thanks. The next one on the list is Vittorio.
Hi, thank you, Christoph, for your talk. Extremely interesting and enlightening. I had a question about the theogonic process in God, and how do you understand this theogonic process? Is it just a mere bringing to manifestness what is perhaps already hidden, and that will eventually reach the full-blown structure of Trinity? Or is there something more genetic about it that is not necessarily anticipated in the previous stages of the internal dynamic and internal differentiation of the potencies? And how to square also this understanding of perhaps theogonic process, as you as I read in the abstract, with Schelling's earlier understanding of the absolute in the philosophy of identity and the Darstellung meines Systems, presentation of my own system of philosophy, and how to square this internal dynamic, full-blown dynamic dynamism of the absolute and the ages of the world with this earlier conception of the absolute in the philosophy of identity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your question. I think it is not just like developing something that God has already inside of him. That would be like a necessary development, but it's also not that that's absolutely free development. Regarding the first one, which Schelling also calls the freedom to be or not to be, there are just two options for God: to be or not to be. That is the question. So if God chooses to be, and we all know he chose to be, then there is a certain there are certain consequences for God and for us all. So Schelling leaves it open that God has something like a decision out of his freedom, not a conscious freedom, of course, but out of freedom to be. But that's only we only know it from the fact that it just happened that he chose to be. So there is a logical moment or element in God of his development, but the fact that God chooses A and chose A and not B or non-A remains a fact. But the development starting with God having chosen A is we are able to logically reconstruct this this development. So that's not just like teleological development of something that's already hidden in God and it's just breaking out, and we already knew what will happen. But it's kind of a mixture. Yeah.
Thank you. Karin?
Okay, thanks, Christoph, for this paper. So I'm an outsider to this debate. I read the early Schelling a long time ago, but never ventured to the later stages. And so my question will maybe be somewhat naive, yes? But so I think that that Schelling operates with a certain type of analogical reasoning. And I think that if we abstract from all the complexities, then we can go back to the idea, the classical idea, that our insight into how the human mind operates can be used to make claims about God. Yes, we move from the human mind to the divine mind by abstracting from the limitations that we attribute to the human mind. So in this way, we get from the human mind to divine cognition and divine willing. And it seems to me that that Schelling then draws a certain analogy from our, let's say, classical classical cognition of divine cognition and divine willing, and in a way abstracts again from certain, let's say, representational contents, so as to in a way purify a certain type of cognition willing that can then be considered to be instantiated in God, in human being, and probably also in nature, etc. Yeah, so so I think this is interesting, yes, and in a way you find something similar also in Hegel's Science of Logic, yes, where Hegel says, look, you know, the content of the Science of Logic is, as it were, the content of God's thoughts before creation. Yes, where a certain type of absolute thinking is isolated, but clearly based on what we take ourselves to know about divine cognition, which itself is the result of a certain projection of human cognition onto a kind of divine being.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, well, do you agree with this picture? And more specifically, does Schelling himself have anything to say about the use of this type of analogical reasoning or extrapolation as a means that we can use in philosophy to, as it were, specify things about things that in fact are unknown to us? Yes, because no one knows what was going on before creation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so how do we get insight into this? Well, by extrapolating from something that we know, yes, that we know either from Christianity or from reflecting on what's going on in the human mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I totally agree with your picture because Schelling himself is alluding to it several times and to this analogical reasoning, as you called it. And the reason Schelling is able to use this analogy lies in God becoming Jesus Christ. So that's the idea, because God himself is or has become a human being in Jesus Christ. We are able to understand God through this human nature of God. I think that is something he took from Hamann and Herder, who both dealt with this analogy and tried to explain why we are able and to know God or have a knowledge of God or comprehend God, even if we are finite beings. This is the historical justification of Schelling's method here. And there is another access to God's internal life, and this access is we have what Schelling calls a Mitwissenschaft. What is the English translation of Mitwissenschaft? I don't know, something like a knowledge of the past before creation, and that's inside ourselves. And through remembering these early stages where human beings were on Earth or there, we have an access to God's internal life. So it's not just an analogy. We also have something inside of us, like a genetic knowledge or something like that, through which we have an access to what happened in the past before the world was created. So these are two strings of Schelling's method. He combines and in order to justify his own approach.
Okay, well, I'm in fact rather skeptical about this second point, but I don't think that we have time to discuss this further.
Okay.
Maybe after the session, Karin, in the informal part. So we now move to Connor, and please keep your questions and answer a little bit shorter because we are other people on the list.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Quick question about time. So I guess it's clear from your talk that the chronological structure of the beginning that you mentioned, the 4 steps, has to be understood figuratively. But I'm curious when you think time actually comes in. Is it when big A squared takes a step out out from the rotary motion of the minor potencies. Yeah, what you have to say about that. And then small follow-up, when does time become known as something that we can know?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think time just takes place in the fourth period, only described very briefly, because in the fourth period, there is something like a decision or something like a crisis. That means that the potencies are separated from each other. So they are not, the minor potencies are very, they are connected to each other. They cannot exist without each other. They are not separated from each other. And with the crisis or the decision, the potencies are separated. And that's an important condition for distinguishing the different aspects of time, that mean past, present, and future. So in period 4, we have something like the beginning of time, not in our worldly sense, but in a divine sense. There we have the different periods. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We move to Luis.
Okay, thank you so much, Christoph. This was very interesting, and the discussion so far is fascinating. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the status of what Schelling is actually doing here, because you made the comparison with Fichte and Hegel, which is very interesting, and of course Fichte will use this structure to sort of deduce the category, so it is a structure of transcendental logic, in a certain sense. And the structure in Hegel's logic is also something that he will use to move around different a priori thoughts and figures of thoughts. So in both cases, we have the impression that the structure is being used to show us how thought actually works. But in the case of Schelling, it seems to be more than that. But at the same time, it's not a philosophy of history. So if you could say something about the status of what he's doing, is it a science? What is that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think he is doing almost exactly the same as Hegel did in the science of logic. He's trying to find out the fundamental structure of reality. So after that, he can transfer this structure to nature and to history or spirit. And that's why we find the same structure in every other realms, in nature and this spiritual world. And we also find the structure in mythology. Yeah, it's not much different from that what Hegel's trying in his logic. It's not that logical, yeah, but we have a development of concepts like that of being and non-being, of becoming, of essence and form, ground and existence. These are all categories Hegel uses in his logic himself. And so I prefer reading it in such a way. I think it's more fruitful to read Schelling like that, to compare him to Hegel, probably to Fichte, but okay, transcendental logic is something different from it, but to compare it to Hegel and to try to find something like a logical sense. And here Schelling is much more differentiated than Hegel, because he has several different relationships between being and non-being. It's not just being and nothing becomes becoming. It is being and non-being have several different relationships, and there are about 3 or 4 periods where he distinguishes these different relationships between both them. So I'm trying to do exactly this comparison. I know that it's sometimes it's not that successful, but for me it's more fruitful than to say, okay, this is just mythology or irrational philosophy or something like that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
All right, I think we have time for one very short last question. Raim, please.
Thank you very much. I was just thinking that the word you were looking for in English is innate, maybe. But although
Okay.
what you described it is more like Jung's collective unconsciousness.
Yeah.
This is not really my question. My question is, if we move forward 25 years after this text, we come to his lectures on Revelation and the lectures on mythology. Has he given answers there to all the tensions in the text you're dealing with? Please.
Yeah, thank you for your question and for the word. He's trying to find answers to these questions. I think it's much more difficult to discover something like the logical core of his lectures on philosophy of revelation and mythology than to find it in the ages of the world. So the answers could be a little bit different from that out of the answers of the late, or the solutions or the attempts of the late Schelling differs from the attempts of the Schelling of the ages of the world. But the way of presentation, for me, it's much clearer in the ages of the world than it is in his lectures on philosophy of revelation, for example, or mythology, where the focus doesn't lie on logic or the doctrine of the potencies, but on mythology and revelation, on the Bible and all these texts. So I think it's also important to draw something like a thread from the early, not the early Schelling, the Schelling of the ages of the world to his late philosophy, and use the philosophy he develops earlier to elucidate what he's doing in his late projects.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we have to stop here for the moment. But once again, remember that we will keep the Zoom meeting open for informal discussion. So once again, thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Kyla. And thank you to all the people joining the session today. It was a very interesting discussion. And yes, goodbye and see you next time.